Well, so good to have all of you with us today. We're in part 4 of this series, Camouflage. And well, to kind of take a step into part 4, I want you to use your imagination. Now, I thought about actually putting the images up on the screen, but here's the thing. Sometimes our imagination does so much better. And so I'm going to share with you 3 different headlines that I just think are hilarious when you will imagine what it could have looked like. The first one happened just on the Pennsylvania Turnpike back in 2019 around Downingtown, and this was the headline: "Spilled soap makes a mess on highway." Literally, a tanker filled with dish soap crashes, and the soap gets everywhere. And I read through the article, and they talked about how do we clean that up? I'm like, well, do you have to clean up soap? Maybe it just makes the highway clean. Who knows? The second one, the image is going to be amazing in your mind. This was the headline: "Truck carrying 7,500 pounds of slime eels overturned on Oregon highway, creating stinky mess." Now, I'm not really sure what a slime eel is, but 7,500 pounds, what are you doing with that many slime eels? Can you imagine what that highway looked like? And how would you even start cleaning that up? But this next headline, you got to put yourself right in the time and space that this happened. You see, this was right in the middle of 2020, and we all remember what was going on in 2020. And this happened up in Canada, in Ottawa to be specific. And well, this was the headline: "Clean up on Highway 401, crash spills toilet paper across busy highway." I think if we would have actually read that headline back in 2020, we all would have tried to figure out how to sneak across the border to pick up some, free toilet paper. But you think about all 3 of those headlines. What a mess. Just what a complete mess. I don't even know, how do you start cleaning up a highway from dish soap or slime eels? Toilet paper's a little easier, but the other 2, it's like, where do you even start? I started thinking about all 3 of the truck drivers. I'm not saying they caused the accident, but they were driving the truck filled with, those products. And you see, when the truck driver crashed the truck, maybe someone cut them off, who knows? They created the mess. They were responsible for, the slime eels, the toilet paper, the dish soap, the product that they were transporting. They were responsible. But their mess got all over everyone and everything else, didn't it? Just because they crashed their truck doesn't mean that their mess didn't stay just with them. It got everywhere. In part 3, we gave everyone one of these little pieces of paper. If you're part of part 3 at one of our physical locations, or if you're connecting online, you had one of these. I actually challenged you to write a percentage on here and then to crumple up and throw it somewhere. In fact, if you walked into one of our physical campuses today, you saw these pieces of paper all over the floor. And if you missed part 3, you're wondering, do they never clean their church buildings? We do. You see, this was the impact. You see, your mess, no matter how big or small the mess is, it does get all over the place. So right now, take your piece of paper that you have in your hands and just crumble up and find someone that you know, maybe don't know, and just gently toss it at them. You see, this is what happens. We think that our mess is all self-contained, but in all reality, our mess is never self-contained. No matter how much we try to keep our mess internal, our mess always goes external to some degree, doesn't it? And what I find so encouraging in the midst of my mess, the mess I own, the mess that I'm trying to keep internal, even though I understand it goes external. What's so amazing about my mess and your mess is that God meets you, God meets me right in the midst of our mess. Isn't that amazing? And that's what I love about this story, about this guy named Jacob that we've been following throughout this entire series, Camouflage. Over and over again, God meets Jacob in the midst of the mess. You see, Jacob's story actually starts with his mother, Rebecca. She wanted to be a mom, and her husband Isaac wanted to be a dad. And finally, one day, right? It's like one of those just exciting days where she realizes she is pregnant. But then God comes to her and says, hey, Rebecca, I just want you to know, I know you're excited to be a mom. And Isaac, I know you're excited to be a dad, but there's two nations. I mean, God shares with Rebecca that the journey ahead of her is going to be difficult. The journey ahead of her is going to be filled with division. The journey ahead of her wasn't some fairy tale story. But yet, Rebecca still wanted to be a mom. And then the day arrives, happy birthday. She gives birth to two twins, Jacob and Esau. And well, on one side, that's a happy day. But what we're told was Esau came out first and Jacob, and it was this image of Jacob holding on to Esau's heel because Jacob wanted to be first. And they named him Jacob, which means deceiver, supplanter. The mess gets messier because then we learn that Isaac, the dad, loved Esau, the oldest son, the most, and Rebekah, the mom, loved Jacob, the youngest, the most. And favorites never create less of a mess, does it? Well, Jacob wanted the birthright and the blessing, and so one day, Esau came back from hunting. He was famished, and Jacob had a bowl of lentil stew. And Jacob said to his brother, hey, I'll give you a bowl of stew since you're so hungry for your birthright. And you see, for Esau, he was focused on the bowl of now and not the future. And so he gave his birthright to his younger brother for the bowl of lentil stew, the bowl of now. But Jacob wasn't done with that. He wanted the blessing as well. And so Jacob and his mom concocted a plan to deceive, to trick dad, to give him the blessing, not Esau. And so they successfully do that. Isaac blesses Jacob, and now Jacob has the birthright and the blessing. But then what happens? Well, the blame game kicks in. Esau starts blaming Jacob, and dad blames mom, and mom blames son. I mean, the blame game was going everywhere. And here's what we all know. The blame game always ends the same way, with your mess getting everywhere. Well, Rebecca comes to her son Jacob and says, hey, you got to get out of here now because Esau is going to kill you. So Jacob takes off, and God guides him to a place. And by himself, all alone, making a mess of the family that was his. In the midst of nowhere, God shows up. God is now here. And Jacob called that place Bethel, a place that 20-some years later he would come back to. But that time, 20 years later, he'd be walking back with a limp from wrestling with God. You're talking about a mess. I mean, this is the story. Now, before Jacob took off, his mom and dad told Jacob, hey, you need to head north to a city called Haran, and you need to get married. And when Jacob was, in Bethel, God comes to him and says, hey, Jacob, your descendants would be as numerous as the stars. And here's what we all know. To have descendants as numerous as the stars, you got to get hitched. You got to get married. So Jacob, listening to his mom and dad say, hey, go to Haran and get married. And then God says, hey, your descendants, the covenant I made with your grandpa Abraham, hey, your descendants, you got to get married. And so, well, Jacob continues north and he starts to head to Haran. Now, what we need to know is between Bethel, where God meets Jacob right in the midst of his mess, and Haran. And Haran is a very important place because this is where Abraham, Father Abraham, Jacob's grandpa, when he went from Ur north, he settled in Haran. And between these two places is some 500 miles. I mean, this was a lengthy journey. But Jacob was going, and he had a lot of time to think. Think about how his life turned out. Think about how he had manipulated and deceived. Think about how now he's all alone. His entire family structure is back home, and now he's heading hundreds and hundreds of miles away from them. So as he walks, he reflects. As he walks, I'm sure his heart was heavy. As he walks, he realizes the gravity of the mess that has been created. And one day, as he continues to walk north, he looks up, and we're told that he sees some shepherds. And so he goes up to them. He says, my brothers, where are you from? And they're like, hey, we're from Haran, they replied. I'm sure he was excited, going, oh, I'm close. Right? He didn't have GPS. He didn't have Google Maps to follow the line and count down the miles. And all of a sudden, he's like, oh, I'm finally almost there. And so he said to them, hey, do you know Laban, Nahor's grandson? Now, this is important to catch. Laban is, well, Jacob's uncle. It's his mother's, Rebekah's brother. And probably, more than likely, they had never met before, but they're still family. And he's like, hey, do you know Laban? And they're like, yeah, we know him, they answered. And then Jacob looks at him like, well, is he well? And they're like, yes, he is. And in fact, right in this moment, they see off in the distance, well, Rachel, one of his daughters, coming with, well, her sheep. You see, Rachel was a shepherdess, and she was part of Laban's business empire. And Laban was very wealthy. He had done very well for himself. And so Rachel's coming from the distance. And well, what we need to know is all of these shepherds would gather in this very specific spot. In fact, in verse 2, we're told that there's a well and there's a large rock that was in front of the well to protect it from, well, probably outside tribes and outside countries and outside forces. And so they would roll this massive rock, but they would all gather there. And when everyone got there together, they would move the rock so they could water their sheep. And then together they would move this rock back into place to protect the well, and they'd go their separate ways. And so all of a sudden, Rachel, well, is almost there. And Jacob goes over and rolls this massive stone, a stone that took multiple shepherds to roll away. But Jacob does it by himself. And you see, it'd be easy to think that it was just because Jacob was that strong. But remember what God said to Jacob in Bethel, in the midst of nowhere. God says, I'm going to be present with you. And I'm going to protect you. And I'm going to provide for you. And my promises will always happen. Hey, Jacob, I am with you. And I think this is such a powerful picture of God's strength through Jacob. To say, hey, Jacob, no matter where you go, no matter what you do, I am with you. So he rolls the stone out of the way. He waters Laban's sheep, and then he goes up to Rachel. And we're told that he kisses Rachel. Now, this isn't like an affectionate boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife type of kiss. This is like more of a familial, like kin, friendship type of kiss. And so he goes up and kisses her. And then he weeps. When I got to that part and read that he weeps, I'm like, why? And I think it all goes back to that moment at Bethel. In the midst of nowhere, God meets him there. In the midst of nowhere, he realizes that God is now here. In the midst of his mess, God goes, Jacob, the covenant I made with your grandfather Abraham and to Isaac and to you, that your descendants will be as numerous as the stars, that Jacob, something significant is going to happen through your life. I think Jacob starts to weep because he realizes that God is doing something big, that God is on the move, that God, even in his complete mess of Jacob's life, Jacob's like, my life's a mess, but God is still faithful. If you think that God can't use you because your life is a mess, I mean, this one story, let alone all the other stories in the Bible, should give you hope and encouragement. And Jacob weeps to say, God is moving, God is working, and his promises are coming true. Well, the author tells us that Rachel runs back, probably leaves her sheep there, runs back to tell her dad, Laban, who she just ran into. We're also told that Laban comes out to meet Jacob, and when he does, he embraces him like, hey, you're family. And then there's this interesting line that Jacob works for a month. So he works for a month. A month was coming to an end, and Laban comes to Jacob and says, just because you're a relative of mine, should you work for me for nothing? Which is that's an upstanding businessman question. Hey, you've worked for a month, I need to pay you something. And then he opens the story. He goes, hey, tell me what your wages should be. It's almost kind of like a blank check. Well, Jacob kind of seizes the moment and says, hey, Laban, I'll work for you for 7 years. 7 years. And just think about that time period. I mean, a month is pretty short. 7 years, this is a long time. But what Jacob was going to ask for, he knew was worth this amount of time. You see, Jacob wanted to marry one of Laban's daughters. Laban had 2 daughters, Leah and Rachel. The author gives us some really specific descriptions and images of, who these 2 daughters were. We find out that Leah was the oldest and Rachel was the youngest. When we looked at their names in Hebrew, the name Rachel literally means you, which goes into her being a shepherdess. Remember, they didn't name kids for cute, cuddly little names like we do now. They named kids just very practically. Jacob, deceiver, supplanter. Esau, red garment, right? Very practically. But what's interesting, Rachel, the ancient Hebrew, we know that means you. But when it comes to Leah's name, there's a little bit of confusion. But either one of these options aren't really flattering to Leah. You see, the Hebrew word for Leah could be translated weary. Again, not real flattering. But in the ancient Akkadian language, which was older than Hebrew, there's a Akkadian word that many scholars feel like it's where the name Leah came from, which is literally translated cow. Again, I'm not saying that's good. I'm just saying this is what it is. And most scholars, when you get into their naming, really feel like it was a play off of this ancient Akkadian language word for cow, especially when you slide these 2 sisters together and Rachel, her name means you. And it doesn't get much better for Leah. We're told that Leah's eyes were weak eyes. And the eyes were an important part during these ancient times because women would wear a veil around their face and all you could see was their eyes. So their eyes actually meant a lot. And we're told that her eyes were weak or dull. And then the author gets to Rachel and we're told that, well, Rachel had a lovely figure. And then the author ends with saying she was beautiful. And Jacob wanted to marry Rachel. Rachel. And he tells Laban, hey, Laban, for 7 years, I'll work for you. 7 years. I'll give you my all. 7 years. I'm all in. If I can marry your youngest daughter, Rachel. And Laban says, okay, you got a deal. And then, this is like right out of like a Hallmark movie or a Lifetime movie. Then we're told that Jacob served his 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her, right? Doesn't that sound like a Hallmark movie, a Lifetime movie? And I know you're wondering right now, Chris, how in the world do you know that's every plot of a Hallmark or Lifetime movie? It's not because I watch them. You see, every Thanksgiving and Christmas holiday season, my mom with my wife and my girls, this is all they watch all the time. I'll walk upstairs and I'm like, this is the same movie, just different people, different specific. It's the same plot line. And you can just feel the love, can't you? You can feel the love. 7 years, it felt like only a month. And the day came and Jacob goes to Laban and says, give me my wife. My time is completed. I've worked for you for 7 years, and then now I want to make love to her. You see, what Jacob was saying is to make love with her would mean the official covenant of marriage would be made. Because once that act happened, it couldn't be broken. So Laban says, okay, you've worked your 7 years. So Laban throws a massive feast, invites all of these guests. It was a celebration. It was a party. And Jacob, who had worked 7 years, now gets to marry Rachel. And so the wedding happens. They go back to their little bungalow. And, the morning came. The next day, Jacob is now married to Rachel. And he wakes up, sun shining through. He rolls over to stare at his bride. And there was Leah, not Rachel. Could you imagine that moment? And you might be wondering, how does that happen? Well, two important insights that we have to understand of how this happened. First of all, remember, they would wear a veil that would cover their face. First of all. Second thing is, Laban threw a feast, and the wine would have been flowing a lot. So Jacob probably wasn't all there. Leah had a veil on, and they didn't have lights everywhere back then, and it was dark. And when the sun came out, and he could see, and when he sobered up a bit, and he could see, all of a sudden he realized he was tricked. It's Leah, not Rachel. Could you imagine that moment? And could you imagine that moment for Leah? Leah knew he wanted to marry Rachel. This is some hidden secret. She knew. Jacob knew. Laban knew. And so Jacob finds Laban. He goes, what is this that you've done to me? I served you for Rachel. You knew that. Everyone knew that. I was in love with Rachel, didn't I? And why have you deceived me? You see, the deceiver is now deceived. Jacob, who spent a life deceiving person after person after person, now finds himself being deceived by Laban. So what are we to do? Well, Laban tells him, he goes, hey, it's not our custom here to give you the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. What's Laban doing here? He's doing the blame game. He's saying to Jacob, Jacob, I don't know what your customs are. You back home, I don't know what your customs look like. But here, our customs are different. We don't give away the youngest before the oldest. Laban just starts playing the blame game. I mean, Laban knew what he did. It wasn't like the customs were the real excuse. He knew what he did. But now he's just playing a little bit of a blame game, something that, well, Jacob is all too familiar with. And then he goes, finish the daughter's bridal week, Leah's. Then we'll give you the younger one also in return for another 7 years of work. Saying, hey, if you want Rachel, it's another 7 years. Well, Jacob made love to Rachel also, and his love for Rachel was greater than his love for Leah. And again, think about this mess. Did Rachel know that? Yep. Did her sister Leah know that? Yep. Did everyone around them know that Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah? Yes. You think about the mess. You think about the hurt. You think about the insecurity. You think about the betrayal. You think about the mess. And they all knew that Dad manipulated the whole situation. And you worked for Laban for another 7 years. You see, and this is important. Your mess makes a mess. I mean, it just does. Again, no matter how much you think your mess is internal, your mess always goes external. Always does. That you're a mess. And that's why it's so important. We are experts at pointing out everyone else's mess. And if we would just reverse that time and reverse that energy and reverse that focus on ourselves and go, wait a minute. Yeah, they're messy. But I realize that my mess gets on everyone else. My insecurity, my control, my addiction, my manipulation, my sarcasm, my gossip, my fill in the blank. My mess, it always leaks out. And it always gets on everyone else around me. So, how do we unmess our mess? How do you unmess your mess? It really is this simple. First, you gotta name it. And the only way you can name it is stop pointing out everyone else's mess. It's that simple. Stop focusing on everyone else's mess, because when you're doing that, it's a blame game. And the blame game always ends the same way, with more of a mess. Start naming your mess, not anyone else's. Start looking at your mess, the mess that you think you're hiding inside, and the mess that you know you're not hiding inside. Name it. Write it down. Put it on Post-it notes and put it on your mirror. I don't know. Name your mess. What is your mess right now that you have convinced yourself is inside? And all of a sudden, right now, in this moment, you're like, it's not. Because it's all over the place, isn't it? And then own it. Your mess. Whatever percentage of that mess is yours, own that percentage with 100%. All of it. Own it. Say it out loud. My mess is getting on other people. My mess is hurting other people. My mess is fracturing other relationships. Whether it's internal, external, doesn't matter. And then you gotta unmess it. What do I mean by unmessing it? You got to just be real with yourself and real with the people that you're getting your mess on. I came home just the other night, and I was just tired. I was exhausted. I walked in the house, and the house was just not clean, and my youngest was in the kitchen, and I just lost my mind. Yeah, I had said to her multiple times to clean up the kitchen. Yes, I had said multiple times to put stuff away. Yes, I said multiple times to close the cabinet. I mean, parents, you've all been there. But how I responded to her, how I reacted to her, she got tears in her eyes and she went upstairs. And I found myself standing at the kitchen counter going, Chris, be frustrated, yes. But just how you responded and how you, come on, Chris. It's not how you should have handled that situation. Again, that was my mess that I just got all over her. So I picked up my cell phone because I guess that's how you parent in this day and age. I called her, she's upstairs. I said, hey, Claire, will you come downstairs? She walked downstairs and walked in the kitchen. She kind of had that look like, oh no, Dad just wants to talk to me again. I just looked at her and said, I just want you to know, I'm sorry for how I just shared what I shared with you. I go, I did not share that in the right way. I didn't go into a lecture about how frustrated I am because the cabinets and I just owned my mess. And she walked around the counter and walked up to me and gave me a hug. How do you unmess it? By unmessing it. Lowering your pride, lowering your ego, lowering whatever that is, and unmessing it. Is there a mess that you need to unmess right now? Go unmess it. I think about Jacob's story. I think about Jacob. He goes for one wife. He ends up with two wives. Not only does he end up with two wives, as the story continues, each one of his wives had a maid servant, a handmaid. He ended up having two surrogate moms as well. Between the four of them, 12 sons. 12 sons. I mean, there's a whole bunch of mess in these storylines. And out of the 12 sons came tribes which became the nation of Israel. And from one of those tribes, in the midst of all of this mess, God sent Jesus to unmess all of our messes. Think about that. You see, there is a miracle that only God can do in the middle of your mess, in the middle of my mess. If you think God can't work through your mess, the story of Jesus is everything. Because through all of that time and all of those messes came Jesus to die for you, your mess, and to die for me, my mess. If you think God can't use you, if you think God can't lead you through the mess that either you created or someone else created and it's now on you, take some time and start reading through the stories of the Bible, because the stories of the Bible are filled with messy people that God does something significant in and through. God wants to use you right in the midst of your mess, whether you created it or not, to do something. God, in the midst of nowhere, is with you. Let's pray. Lord, I just pray. Every single person will know, no matter how big their mess is, that you're with them in the midst of the mess. And in the midst of the mess, God, you do the miraculous. And that gives us hope. That gives us encouragement. And that gives us courage. In your name I pray. Amen.